Hello and welcome to this presentation on keeping the lights on with SQL Server 2012's Always On. My name is Warwick Rudd. I'm a SQL Server consultant and certified trainer with WARDY IT Solutions, Australia's leading SQL Server specialists. In today's presentation we're going to have a look at the components that make up SQL Server 2012's Always On, how you can configure your environment and how you can monitor your environment once you have that set up. Before we dive into the components and how to configure, let's have a look at a possible solution that you may implement in your environment. So what we can see here is we've got 3 data centers consisting of 4 servers, and we've got 4 standalone instances of SQL Server 2012 on each of those servers. Those servers are belonging to a single Windows Server failover cluster residing in a single domain. We've got the ability to have multiple availability groups, as well as multiple availability group listeners, utilizing a combination of both synchronous and asynchronous data transfer from our primary replica to our secondary replicas to meet our high availability and disaster recoverability requirements. A slight variation on this is that we can add a further server to our primary site, and instead of doing a standalone instance on our primary replica, we're going to create a clustered instance on our primary, giving us the ability to cater for a server failure in the primary site without having to fail over to any of our secondary sites. One thing you will need to know about if you are utilizing this setup is that it restricts you from being able to do an automatic failover from your primary replica to any of your secondary replicas. So let's have a look at configuring our environment. To give you a little bit of a background on this, I've got a 2-node Windows Server failover cluster, Server Core Node 1 and Server Core Node 2. Now, to configure Always On in our environments, we need to connect to the properties of our instance of SQL Server. On the Properties tab, you will now find a new tab called Always On High Availability. By enabling this, it allows us to include that instance of SQL Server into an always-on availability cluster. For it to take effect, the instance of SQL Server needs to be restarted after you've changed that configuration. This will just take a couple of seconds. There we go. Now, this needs to be done on all of the servers that are participating in our Always On cluster. So just changing over to our secondary node, doing exactly the same as what we did before, going into the properties of our instance of SQL Server and configuring that checkbox on our Always On High Availability tab. And do a restart. And when that comes back to us, we will be ready to go. So let's go back to our presentation. Now, the components that you need to be aware of for SQL Server 2012's Always On are availability replicas. You can have a single primary replica, which is where your user databases reside, and you can have up to 4 secondary replicas, allowing you to meet your requirements for high availability and or disaster recoverability. Availability databases are your user databases residing on your primary replica that your applications are connecting to on a day-to-day basis. For your availability databases to participate in an availability group, there are some rules which must be met. Only user databases can be added to availability groups. Those databases must be in a read-write mode, so no read-only databases can be added to an availability group. Your database must be in a multi-user mode, and you can't have the database option auto-close enabled. The database must also be in a full recovery mode, and you can only have a database in a single availability group. An availability group is a grouping of associated databases that you wish to transfer from your primary replica to your secondary replicas. the data transfer is achieved by the availability modes. And you can have up to 2 synchronous data transfer from your primary to your secondaries per availability group. And an availability group listener allows for your applications to connect to your database without needing to know whether it is residing on your primary or your secondary. With the security on AlwaysOn, you need to configure the security on your primary replica as well as on your secondary replicas. So you will need to have a nightly job set up that looks at the security which is set up on your primary, extract that out and implement it onto your secondaries to ensure that you are up to date in the event of a failover. So let's have a look at setting up some availability groups. So if we transfer over onto our instance that has Management Studio, with our configuration that we did earlier, we can now see we have this tab called AlwaysOn High Availability, and we're able to navigate. We have no availability groups. So we're going to create 2 availability groups, an auto and a manual. So this can be done using a wizard, which is nice and simple. We come in here, we give our availability group a name, we'll make it nice and simple. And we need to select the database that we're going to have in that availability group. Now with those rules that I was mentioning just before, the status here, if it meets all of those rules, then we can add it to an availability group. So for our auto, we're going to select that EventedWorks DW database. Now we're going to do it as an automatic failover, so we select that and it automatically says that it's going to be in a synchronous data transfer. Now we have the ability to set up that our secondary is a readable secondary or not. We're going to leave that at this point in time because we don't want to make it available. We're then going to add where we want to replicate it over to. So we select our second node and we want to configure it so that it is exactly the same. Now at this point in time we're able to create our listener. So if we come back here and we get our listener name, we give it our listener name, we give it the port that we're going to be listening on, and we give it the IP that we want to be connecting to. Okay. We need a central location that every node in the cluster has access to for the databases to allow it to initialize the database on the secondaries. Goes and runs some checks, make sure that everything is okay, and we click next, and it's now going to go away and create our availability group, add our database to that availability group, synchronize it over to our secondary node, and we are good to go with a replicated database using AlwaysOn with a synchronous data transfer or with an automatic failover. When that completes, shouldn't take too much longer, and there we go. And we're complete. So what we can do is we do a refresh at this point in time, and we can see here's our availability group. It tells us the nodes which are participating as replicas, tells us the database, and there's our listener. If we come over onto our secondary server, there's our database and it's in a synchronized state. If I try and access it, it gives me an error because we said we don't want to have access to that. So let's quickly go back and we'll just create our second availability group for our manual. Now there's not going to be, now already participating in an availability group, so it meets those rules. We're not able to add it. So we're choosing the second database that we want to add. We're not going to make it automatic failover, and we're not going to make it synchronous. But we are going to make it available for us on our secondary. We're going to add our secondary, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make it readable over there. We're not going to create a listener for this particular one. Backup locations are the same, goes and tests everything. Tells us that our listener configuration hasn't been done. That's fine. We can go and create a listener after the fact if we want to. And hit finish. It's going and doing exactly the same thing, and when it completes we'll see we'll now have two databases on, and we've completed. We come back here, do a refresh on our secondary node, and there's our database, and we've actually got access to it because we made it readable. So let's just add some data to that secondary. So we've just gone and created a table and put some data into our newly created database. So if we come over onto our secondary to just query that from our database being and we have 300 rows of data. Now we've got the ability to add databases to an availability group. So I'm just going to create a blank database, perform a backup of that database, and now we're able to add that database to our manual availability group which we added earlier. So using the wizard once again, we're able to see that the other databases which exist in this instance are already participating in availability groups, so they don't meet the requirements. So we've only got the new database which we've just created, so we select that. It uses the same backup location as before, and we need to connect to our secondary, which it already knows about, so that we can perform the data synchronization. Does the checks, and we go finish. And this is going through those steps. We've now completed successfully. We hit close, and if we come back over here to our secondary, perform a refresh of our databases, and when that comes back to us we should see that our newly created database add to AAG should be created. This is taking a little bit longer than what I expected. There we go, and there's our database, and we've got access to that newly created database in our asynchronously replicated availability group.